Hello, and welcome to this tutorial on how to authenticate requests when using Quart. My name is Philip Jones, and you can find out about me at pgjones.dev, including this tutorial and others at pgjones.dev/tutorials. Now, I'm recording this video on the 1st of the 1st, 2023, so Happy New Year to you. Okay, let's begin. Firstly, what is Quart? Well, Quart is a Python web microframework that has the same API as Flask, but is re-implemented using async await. Therefore, if you're familiar with Flask, or if you've come across Quart, hopefully you recognize this very simple and expressive way of defining routes and their responses. So that's what Quart is. In addition, I'm going to use the Quart-Auth extension to handle the authentication. And the documentation for that is available here, but I'm not going to go through it because this tutorial will instead. Okay, let's dive in. First things first, let's create a new virtual env for this project. So I'm using Python 3.11 and I'm going to create a virtual env. So as we just wait a few seconds for my laptop to catch up and then we can activate it. So what do we want to install? We want to install Quart and Quart-Auth. And as these install, I'm going to create a new file called app.py. And in there, I'm just going to create a very basic Quart app, much like we just saw in the quick start. So familiar, like I said, if you're familiar with Flask, this is going to be very familiar to you. Indeed, most framework languages have adopted this decorator syntax as introduced by Flask. I'm just going to create an index route that's going to return hello. So very simple. And to run it, I just use Quart run, but I'm going to add the reload flag so that it reloads the server every time I make changes to the code. That just saves a bit of time. So now if I go to the browser, it should load up, and there we go. And I've got the network tab open here so we can take a look at it as we go on. Okay, so we've got a public route here. So let's make a private one. I'm going to call it private. Oops. And this route, I want to return something sensitive. Let's say that. But I don't want any person to be able to view it. Like, as you'd probably expecting, if I view it now, you see I can view it and so can anyone else. I've not provided any authentication. So how can I go about doing this? Well, the most basic form and easiest form of authentication to get going is called basic auth. And Quart-Auth provides this via a basic auth required decorator, which I can add here. However, that's not just it. I need to tell Quart-Auth what username and passwords are valid for this. And I do this via some configuration variables for Quart-Auth, including the basic username and the basic password. So today I'm going to use a username called user, and I'm going to use a password called password. So I'm sure you're aware there are many good reasons why you shouldn't use such a simple password and why you shouldn't store the password in your code. But having it here and having it visible just makes this code more readable. So please don't actually do this in production. Store your password in somewhere more sensibly, like a database or in the environment if it's a singular password. But it works here. Now, what I should see happen here is that if I visit private now without providing these credentials, it's not going to allow access. So let's show that. So if I press refresh, see the browser is now asking me for a username and password. This is what it does for basic auth. So I'm going to get it wrong, so I'm going to say the password is Bob. And you see it's still not letting me see it. However, if I type in the correct password, now it allows it. So that's basic auth. So you're probably wondering why most websites don't just do this, given how easy it is. Well, that little dialog we saw pop up here can't really be styled in any way, is a little unpleasant, and often requires the data, the username and password, to be re-entered. So it's not particularly user-friendly. It is actually, in fact, I think basic auth a bit more friendly for usage by like APIs, which we'll come to later. But that's basic auth. Okay, now I'm going to switch to something that's much more common and much more user-friendly, which is cookie-based authentication, which is the default mode of Quart-Auth. So instead of using basic auth, I'm going to use the login required decorator, which doesn't take any arguments, and this will stop any access to this route now unless they're logged in. as long as I've set it up properly. And to do that, I need to import the auth manager and initialize it, auth manager, with the app. And I need to set a secret key for the app itself. Now again, I'm going to create one here. All it needs to be is a random unguessable string. So I'm going to use the secrets module to do that. I'm going to secrets.token URL safe. Let's say it's 16 characters. This will do for me. But again, much like with the password we spoke about earlier, it's not the best practice to keep this in the code itself. It'd be better to store it somewhere in your configuration environment, for example. But it's very clear if I set it up all here. So now I should see that Quart-Auth is preventing access to private without any authentication details. And you can see that it does that. It says it's unauthorized, cannot view it. So how do I authorize? Well, I've got a login. So let's create a login route. So this is going to be a route this time because it's going to need to accept two methods, a get and a post. And this will become clearer as I type out what it does. But what I wanted to do, I forgot def there, is to return a login form by default. So let's actually just define the term. I was going to use, the reason I hesitated there is I was going to use render template string, but I realized I'm not actually rendering anything. This is a constant string, so it should be a bit easier. So form, I'm going to use the method post, and the action by default is the same page, so I don't need to specify the action. I need two inputs in this form, one for the username, one for the password, and this one should ideally be the password type, so it hides what I'm typing. And finally, I need a submission button. Type submit, value, let's say login, so it's nice and clear. Okay, so now if I go to this route, this login route, I should see a login form. Nope, I've done something wrong here. Methods, there we go. There we go. So this is username, this is password. Now, I did say earlier that nobody uses the basic auth because you can't style it. It doesn't look as nice. I realize this doesn't look as nice, but I'm not going to spend time styling it. But obviously you can add whatever CSS you like. So if I just say what this does, if I typed username password, it's going to post it to this route, but that's just going to re-render the form. It doesn't do anything yet. So now we need to make it do something. So if we use the request object, and if we check that the method is post, then we can handle the actual login action. So the first thing we need is the data from the form that's been posted, which we can get via the request global and then the form attribute of it if we await it. Then we just need to check if the username is what we expect, which I'm still going to say is user. And we should check that the password matches as well. Now I'm going to pause here slightly and say that, again, for the clarity in this code, I'm going to do something which I wouldn't normally do in production, which is I'm going to hard code the password and I'm not going to hash it. I'm assuming here this is your user password because it's associated with your username. Now you really should be hashing it and not storing it in the code, and I would recommend a library called bcrypt for that. And I have information about how to do this in my book, but I'm just going to skip over that today so I can focus on how Quart-Auth works. What I am going to do, however, is I'm going to check the password using a time analysis insensitive comparison method, which is called compare digest. So if I hover over this, you can see here this function uses an approach designed to prevent timing analysis. This means that you can't use a timing attack to try and figure out the password that will be valid for this route. Obviously the username isn't a sensitive, which is why I'm just doing a standard equals there. So here we go. So with all that said, I'm going to check the posted password to see if it matches password. And if it does, then I need to log in the user, which is something I do from Quart-Auth. And the user itself is going to be using the auth user model for Quart-Auth. So, I log in the user with a auth user, and then I need to provide an auth ID. And this identifies the user uniquely. So every individual user should have their own auth ID. So this could be anything. In this case, I'm going to use user, but it's more typical to use an ID, such as the member ID in the database, or even a session ID, if you'd like to use that. Okay, carrying on. No point showing the form if someone's just logged in. That's quite unhelpful. So instead, I'm going to redirect. So I need to import that from Quart. Redirect, if I can spell, to a certain URL. So if the login is successful, I'm going to redirect to the private route. So here we go. So just to summarize this logic here, for the login route, it starts with a GET request. If I view this route, I'm going to see the form. When I post the information, if it's correct, I'm going to be sent back to the private, and I should then be able to see the sensitive information. If it's not, I just re-render the form again so I can have another go. So let's show that works. If I do user, the incorrect password to begin with, you see I get the same form even though it's posted now. Now if I do the correct password, you see something sensitive. So it's working. And how's it working? Well, what Quart-Auth does is it sets a cookie with a token. And this token bit here uniquely identifies the user. And you can see when I visit the private page, the browser is sending that cookie with the request. So that's how Quart-Auth knows that this is an authenticated request. All right, so we can do a bit more here. Because we know which the user is, we can say this, being viewed by current user.auth ID. Let's make that nef string. So now if I refresh the page, there you go. It says something sensitive being used by a user. Again, it's identifying that from this cookie token being sent. But I also need to log out. So let's add that as well. app.get logout. So a logout path, async def logout. What do I want to do here? Well, I want to log out the user, which I need to import. That's getting a bit unreadable, so I'll just split that over 2 lines. There we go, that's a bit better. Log out the user, and then I might as well redirect them to the index page, the one that doesn't require authentication. So let's just check that works. So now if I go to logout, get sent back to the index. If I look at private, see it's unauthorized, so I've got to go and log in again. Excellent. So now with this basic setup, I can add as many paths as I want. I just use this login required decorator to make them sensitive. And again, in any route that is login required, I can identify what the actual user is using this auth ID. So that's the basics. Now I'm going to slightly variant this because I realize most people don't actually render from the server anymore. You're probably using a single page app where the front end is doing the rendering. So to convert that over, I just simply need to make it more of a JSON API. So for example, the index returns hello world. The private, let's say, returns a message, something like that. And now the login. Well, again, I'm not rendering anything. So this is all it needs to be is a post route. So I can get rid of this as well. And in this case, it's most likely that instead of sending form data, we're sending JSON data. This still remains the same. That still remains the same. But now we would just return a success. So 200 is stats code, and the braces mean send a JSON response. If it doesn't work, however, we should return something to let the user know, which is a 400 response. So that changes the login route. The logout, still basically the same, except now we just return something empty because it should always succeed. And that's it. This is how we change it over to use with a single page app. Now, any of the API routes we use for a single page app, we can just wrap again with this decorator, and that will prevent it from being accessed by unauthorized requests. And once again, the current user works. So this is all well and good, and I'm not going to show how it works right now because I don't have a single page app to play with. What I am going to show though is what happens if we're working with an API. So let me just clean this up a bit, get rid of the unused imports, and let's ask ourselves that. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say I've got some task. Oop, I lost the task.py. Now I'm just going to open a new terminal, and in this terminal I'm going to install requests. So if I import requests, as you would, let's say I want to get the private information. Localhost 5000 private. So this is like our requests, response. So this could be a fairly common, I hope, script that you might have. So if I run this now, you can guess what's going to happen. Task. It should say a 401 response because it's unauthorized. So how do I make this API more pleasant to use for a task script? Now I say that because when you're doing it like this, cookies are a pain to use. What you want to use is some kind of token. So let's turn it over. Well, Quart has a secondary mode called the bearer mode. So let's change it to that. And how I do it is I say Quart-Auth mode equals bearer. And it's this bearer mode that is designed for API usage. So if I carry on, the login required, all of this stays the same. It's just the login that's going to differ. So now I still do all this, but instead of returning no information, what I need to return is a token for the API to use. So let's create a token. So we use the auth manager and we dump a token. And again, we need an auth ID. And once again, I'm going to use user. And as we're using a JSON API, let's just return the token in the information. So that means I can do the following. You can see the response is request.post. So I'm going to post to the login route. I'm going to pass it the correct JSON, which is a username of user and a password of password. And what I'm expecting is the response JSON to include the token. So let me just run that and you should see it here. So we get the token come out and this is a valid token. So let me just pull the token out. Response.json token is what we need. And now we need to pass this token as a bearer authorization header, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it basically means this. We say that the headers are including an authorization header that itself has a bearer type token, which is the token. Okay, and then we can put this here, headers equals headers, and that will add the token to this request and allow Quart-Auth to know that it's authorized. So if I run it again, we see the response is 200. Now if I do response.json, we should get the secret information being viewed by user, exactly how we expect. So I'll try and pause here because I think I've gone quite quickly actually through this, but hopefully it was very clear. And what I've told you is that Quart-Auth is a Quart extension that supports three types of authentication. The first type, basic authentication, really is basic, so it's hardly a mode in itself, but it's a good way to start. Then there's either cookie or bearer type token authentication, where cookies are really designed for web browsers because, as we've seen, the web browser will send and manage the cookies for you, whereas bearer tokens are more designed for the API usage. Now, after that, it's pretty much the same. We log in users either using login user or by creating a token for them and passing that back in the case of a bearer. And we use that token, which is now either present in the cookie or in this special authorization header to authenticate the requests. And that's what this login required decorator does. Within the requests, we can get who it is via the current user and use it. And yeah, that's it. Now, obviously, that's not quite it. There's quite a bit more you can do with Quart-Auth, and certainly there's quite a bit of configuration you could add, such as controlling of the cookies and the duration of the tokens. But that's it for now. I hope this was clear. And if you did find it clear, then I'd encourage you to take a look at my book, which is a blueprint for production-ready web applications. Now, this book builds this app you can see here, which does indeed have a login page, and it does use Quart-Auth to do it. So if I were to go into the back end of the code, you can see if I go to the members that there is a login route and a register route. And if I go to sessions, you can see that there's a login route just here, including the uses of bcrypt, as I encouraged you to do earlier. So, once again, I hope if you enjoyed this, please take a look at my book, which is available through Pact, and it's called A Blueprint for Production Ready Web Applications. Well, thank you. I hope you have a good year.